It was 1963, and America knew exactly what a car was supposed to be. It was supposed to have a V8 engine, a big, heavy, thundering thing that drank gasoline like it was water and announced itself with a sound that made your chest vibrate. That's what people wanted. That's what people expected. Detroit had spent 2 decades perfecting that formula, and it was working. Then Chrysler pulled up in something that had no pistons, no crankshaft, no valves, no cylinders at all. It ran on a turbine engine, the same basic principle that powers a jet aircraft at 35,000 feet. And they didn't just build one as a show car and park it in a museum. They handed 50 of them to regular American families and said, "Drive it. Tell us what you think." Nobody remembers this, and that's the most interesting thing about it. The story really starts with a problem that nobody in Detroit wanted to admit they had. The V8 engine, for all its muscle, was an engineering compromise held together by a century of refinement and a whole lot of forgiveness. Every time a piston fires, it's a controlled explosion inside a metal chamber. Do that thousands of times per minute, in 8 cylinders simultaneously, and you start to understand the violence the engine is absorbing just to keep you moving. The heat, the vibration, the mechanical stress. Engineers had learned to manage all of it, but they hadn't solved it. They just built systems to survive it. The turbine was different, fundamentally, radically different. Where a piston engine is like a prize fighter, powerful but constantly absorbing punishment, a turbine is more like a gyroscope. It spins, continuously, smoothly. There are no explosions, no reciprocating parts, no jarring mechanical rhythm. The combustion is constant, not cyclical, which means the heat and energy are produced in a steady, controlled flow instead of a series of violent pulses. Think of it this way. A piston engine runs like someone hammering nails one after another as fast as they possibly can. A turbine runs like water flowing through a pipe. The theoretical advantages were almost embarrassing. Fewer moving parts. The Chrysler turbine engine had only 60 parts in its rotating assembly, compared to over 150 in a comparable piston engine. It could run on almost any combustible fuel: gasoline, diesel, kerosene, jet fuel, heating oil, even tequila. One driver actually demonstrated that last one. More on that later. It produced no oil, required no coolant, theoretically needed far less maintenance. So why hadn't anyone done it before? That question is where the real story begins, because the engineers at Chrysler had been trying to answer it for nearly 2 decades. And what they found was that the turbine's greatest strength was also hiding a series of engineering nightmares that no one had yet figured out how to solve. The turbine program at Chrysler didn't start in 1963. It started in 1945, in the quiet aftermath of World War II, when a group of engineers who had spent years watching jet engines power military aircraft started asking a very uncomfortable question. If this technology can move a bomber through the sky at 400 miles per hour, why can't it move a Dodge down a highway? The man leading that charge was George Huebner, not a household name. He should be. Huebner was Chrysler's chief turbine advocate, the kind of engineer who becomes personally identified with an idea to the point where the idea's failure would feel like his own. He was methodical, relentless, and convinced, genuinely convinced, that the piston engine's days were numbered. He started lobbying Chrysler's leadership almost immediately after the war ended, and by 1954 he had convinced them to let his team build the first turbine-powered car in American history. It worked. Barely, but it worked. That first car drove from New York to Los Angeles under turbine power, 3,020 miles. The press called it a publicity stunt. Huebner's team called it a proof of concept. The difference between those two interpretations would define the next 20 years of their lives. But here's what the headlines didn't say. The car had a problem. Several problems, actually. And the most serious one was temperature. A turbine engine produces its power through a process that requires combustion temperatures far beyond anything a piston engine experiences. The hot section of the Chrysler turbine, the part where fuel ignites and drives the turbine wheels, operated at temperatures approaching 1,700 degrees Fahrenheit. That's not an exaggeration. That's close to the melting point of steel. So you now have an engine sitting in a car surrounded by upholstery, wiring, and a fuel tank, running at temperatures that could melt the components holding it together. That should have been impossible to solve. The engineers weren't finished yet. The first weapon they reached for was metallurgy. The turbine wheels, the spinning discs that extract energy from the hot gas, had to be made from exotic alloys, materials that didn't exist in commercial production. Chrysler had to essentially invent new manufacturing processes just to produce components that wouldn't fail after 50 miles, but that solved the structural problem. It didn't solve the efficiency problem. And in the late 1950s, the efficiency problem was threatening to kill the entire program. Here's the physics that was strangling them. A turbine engine is most efficient when it runs hot. The hotter the combustion, the more energy you extract. But the hot exhaust gases leaving the engine were carrying enormous amounts of thermal energy straight out of the tailpipe and into the atmosphere. Wasted, gone. Every mile driven was essentially throwing heat and fuel economy out the back of the car. The numbers were ugly. Early turbine test vehicles were returning fuel consumption figures that would have embarrassed a city bus. Something had to change, and the solution Huebner's team landed on was so elegant it bordered on beautiful. The solution was called a regenerator, and understanding it is the key to understanding why the Chrysler turbine program was genuinely extraordinary engineering rather than just an expensive experiment. Imagine you're heating a house in winter. Every time you open the front door, all that warm air escapes and you have to burn more fuel to reheat the room. Now imagine you could capture that escaping warmth and use it to preheat the incoming cold air before it ever entered the house. You'd use dramatically less fuel. The house would stay warm more efficiently. That's exactly what a regenerator does. Except instead of a house, it's a jet engine, and instead of warm air, it's exhaust gas at over 1,000 degrees. The regenerator was a rotating ceramic disc, roughly the size of a large dinner plate, positioned between the hot exhaust stream and the incoming fresh air. As the disc rotated, slowly about 15 revolutions per minute, one half of it absorbed heat from the outgoing exhaust gases. Then it rotated into the incoming airstream and transferred that heat back into the fresh air before it reached the combustion chamber. The fuel now had a head start. It wasn't igniting cold air. It was igniting air that had already been preheated to several hundred degrees. The efficiency gains were dramatic. Fuel consumption dropped by nearly 30% compared to the early turbine prototypes. Huebner's team had essentially recycled the engine's own waste heat and fed it back into the combustion process. But building that regenerator was another problem entirely. The ceramic material had to withstand constant thermal cycling, heating and cooling hundreds of times per hour, without cracking. It had to maintain precise tolerances while spinning continuously. It had to seal against both the hot exhaust stream and the cool incoming air simultaneously, with almost no leakage between the two sides, or the entire efficiency calculation collapsed. Chrysler's engineers eventually developed a proprietary ceramic compound and a sealing system precise enough that the gap between the rotating disc and its housing was measured in thousandths of an inch. A human hair is approximately 3/1000ths of an inch thick. They were working in tolerances thinner than that. This was not 1990s computer-aided precision manufacturing. This was 1961. These men were doing it with slide rules and machining equipment that was never designed for tolerances this fine. The regenerator worked, and suddenly, for the first time, the turbine car didn't just seem theoretically interesting. It seemed genuinely viable. By 1962, the team had built a fourth-generation turbine engine that fit inside a standard engine bay, produced 130 horsepower, delivered 425 foot-pounds of torque from a complete standstill, a figure that would embarrass most contemporary V8s at idle, and could run for extended periods without the kind of catastrophic failures that had plagued the earlier prototypes. Chrysler's leadership made a decision that was either visionary or reckless, depending on how you look at it. They decided to go public, not with a press release, not with a show car at an auto expo, with 50 cars. Fully functional, professionally finished automobiles, bodied by the Italian coach builder Ghia, finished in a metallic bronze that Chrysler called Turbine bronze, obviously, and handed directly to American families to drive in their daily lives. The engineers had solved the impossible. Now they had to survive the public. The selection process for the 55 drivers, Chrysler ultimately expanded the program slightly beyond the original 50, reads like something between a lottery and a job interview. Applicants had to be licensed drivers, financially stable, and willing to submit detailed feedback reports after every single drive. Chrysler received over 30,000 applications. They chose people from across the country deliberately: a teacher in Ohio, a rancher in Texas, a businessman in California. The idea was to stress test the turbine against the full spectrum of American driving conditions: desert heat, mountain altitude, Midwest winters, coastal humidity. Each family kept the car for 3 months, then returned it. Another family took delivery. The cars rotated continuously through the program for 2 years, and Chrysler's engineers watched. They read every report. They logged every complaint. They tracked every mechanical issue with the obsessive attention of people who understood that the future of their entire program depended on what these ordinary drivers experienced. What those drivers found was genuinely surprising, and not always in the ways the engineers expected. The turbine had a personality unlike anything they had ever driven. Startup was almost surreal. Turn the key, and instead of the familiar cough and rumble of a piston engine catching, there was a rising whine, smooth, almost electronic in character, as the turbine spooled up to idle. It sounded, drivers reported, like a jet aircraft taxiing on a runway. One driver's young son refused to get out of the car for the first week because he was convinced he was about to take off. Acceleration was different too. The 425 foot-pounds of torque available from 0 RPM meant the car pulled away from a stop with a smooth, seamless surge that felt nothing like a V8. No gear hunting, no torque curve to manage. Just thrust, linear and immediate, like the car was being pushed by something that didn't know how to hesitate. Several drivers described it as the closest thing to driving an electric vehicle they could imagine, though that comparison wouldn't have meant anything to them in 1964. Highway driving was where the turbine felt most completely at home. Smooth roads, steady speeds, long distances. This was the environment the engine was designed for. Drivers reported almost no vibration, almost no noise inside the cabin. One woman wrote in her feedback report that she had driven from her home in suburban Chicago to her sister's house in Indianapolis, nearly 180 miles, and arrived feeling less fatigued than she did after her usual grocery run. But city driving revealed the turbine's most notorious flaw, a flaw so counterintuitive that drivers consistently reported it as the single most disorienting thing about the car: throttle lag. When you pressed the accelerator in a piston engine car, the response was essentially immediate, mechanical, cause and effect with almost no delay. But a turbine engine has to spool up. The rotating assembly has to accelerate from idle speed to power-producing speed, and that process takes time, not a long time. Roughly 1 to 2 seconds in the Chrysler turbine, but in traffic, 1 to 2 seconds is an eternity. Drivers learn to anticipate, to press the accelerator before they actually needed the power. It was manageable, but it was never natural, and it became the single most common complaint in the feedback reports. The engineers had a solution in development. But solving that problem was about to create a much larger one. The throttle lag problem pointed toward a deeper truth that Huebner's team had understood for years but hadn't yet fully solved. The turbine engine was extraordinary at doing one thing: spinning continuously at high speed in a stable, controlled environment. What it was not naturally suited for was the stop and start, accelerate and brake rhythm of real-world driving. The engineering term for this is transient response, the engine's ability to react quickly to sudden changes in demand. And in transient response, the piston engine wasn't just better, it was in a completely different category. The solution the engineers were developing involved variable geometry nozzles, adjustable vanes inside the turbine that could redirect the flow of hot gas to accelerate the turbine wheel more quickly during spool-up. Think of it like changing the angle of a garden hose nozzle to increase water pressure without turning up the tap. The principle was sound, the execution was brutally difficult. Getting those vanes to move precisely, repeatedly, at temperatures above 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, without warping or seizing, required materials and tolerances that pushed against the absolute boundary of what 1960s manufacturing could achieve. They were getting close. The fifth-generation engine, which never made it into a production vehicle, showed throttle response improvements that brought it within measurable range of a comparable V8. The engineers believed one more generation of development would close the gap entirely. They never got the chance. In 1973, the world changed. The OPEC oil embargo hit the United States like a freight train. Fuel prices doubled, then doubled again. Lines formed at gas stations stretching around city blocks, and suddenly the conversation in every boardroom in Detroit wasn't about performance or innovation. It was about fuel economy, specifically miles per gallon. The turbine, for all its theoretical elegance, could not win that argument. Not yet. The regenerator had made it competitive, but competitive wasn't enough in a world where Congress was about to pass fuel economy legislation that would reshape the entire American automotive industry. The turbine's fuel consumption, while dramatically improved from the early prototypes, still couldn't match a well-tuned piston engine in the stop-and-go driving cycles that the new regulations used for measurement. Chrysler was also, by the early 1970s, bleeding money. The company that had funded Huebner's dream for nearly 3 decades was heading toward the financial crisis that would eventually require a federal bailout in 1979. Research budgets contracted. Long-term programs got reviewed. And the turbine program, which had consumed an estimated $400 million in today's dollars without producing a single vehicle for public sale, was an obvious target. The program was canceled. The 55 cars were recalled. And here is where the story takes a turn that still makes automotive historians genuinely angry. 46 of the 55 turbine cars were destroyed, crushed. Chrysler cited import duty regulations. The cars had been bodied in Italy by Ghia, and if they entered permanent circulation in the United States, Chrysler would face substantial import tariffs on each one. Destroying them was cheaper than paying the duties. 9 cars survived. They live today in museums, in private collections, in the hands of people who understood what they were looking at. The Smithsonian has one. The Henry Ford Museum has one. Jay Leno, who else, has one, and he drives it. When he fuels it up, he occasionally uses vegetable oil, because it still runs on almost anything. The legacy of the Chrysler turbine program is visible everywhere in modern engineering, even if the connection is rarely made explicit. The ceramic materials developed for the turbine's hot section became foundational research for industrial gas turbines used in power generation today. The regenerator concept, capturing exhaust heat and recycling it into the combustion process, is a direct ancestor of the heat recovery systems in modern hybrid powertrains. The variable geometry nozzle technology that Huebner's team was refining in the late 1960s eventually found its way into turbochargers, and turbochargers are now in roughly half the new vehicles sold globally. The turbine car didn't replace the V8, but the thinking behind it, the relentless pursuit of thermal efficiency, the willingness to question whether the dominant technology was actually the best technology, that thinking never went away. It just found different vehicles. George Huebner retired from Chrysler in 1975, 2 years after the program ended. He spent the rest of his life maintaining that the turbine car had been canceled prematurely, that one more generation of development would have produced an engine competitive with anything Detroit was building, that the oil crisis had killed the program not because the turbine had failed, but because the industry hadn't given it enough time to succeed. He was probably right, and that is the most interesting thing about this entire story. The engineers didn't lose because their idea was wrong. They lost because history moved faster than engineering could follow. The turbine car sits at that specific point in technological history where the solution was real, the progress was genuine, and the finish line was close enough to see, but circumstance ran out before the race could be completed. Somewhere in a museum in Michigan, one of those bronze cars still sits, turbine engine intact, capable of running today on the same fuel in your kitchen cabinet, waiting, as it has been for 60 years, for someone to decide it's time to find out what the next generation would have looked like.